On July 24, 1987, the United States began Operation Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy mission since World War II. Washington reflagged Kuwaiti tankers and sent the U.S. Navy into the Gulf to prove that a superpower could keep commerce moving through hostile waters. But within days, the tanker Bridgeton struck an Iranian mine. The convoy continued, but the lesson was brutal. In a narrow sea lane, a weaker power does not need to destroy the fleet. It only needs to make passage feel unsafe. That lesson never really left Hormuz, and almost 40 years later, it came back. Credibility frame. I am less interested in deciding whether Washington or Tehran was morally right than in understanding why both sides kept making choices that increased pressure without immediately collapsing into total war.
Because that is usually where strategy lives, not in slogans, not in headlines, but in constraints, in incentives, and in the choices an enemy is forced to make. Introduce the framework. The best framework for this story is sea denial through cost imposition. Sea control means you can use the water. Sea denial means you make it too dangerous for the other side to use reliably. And in a choke point like the Strait of Hormuz, denial is often cheaper than control. You do not need to seal the waterway with a giant fleet. You only need to create enough risk that insurers hesitate, crews refuse, shipping firms reroute, and governments panic. Once that happens, the stronger power inherits the burden of reopening trade. That is how geography can turn military asymmetry into strategic leverage. The mainstream view. The mainstream explanation is straightforward, and it is not weak. In this view, Iran's moves around Hormuz were principally retaliation and deterrence. After the United States launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28, 2026, targeting Iranian command centers, missile sites, naval assets, and air defenses, Tehran responded the way a pressured regional power often does, by threatening the single most valuable economic artery it could reach quickly. On March 4th, Iranian forces declared the strait closed, and by March 8th, the UK Maritime Trade Operations Center had recorded 10 attacks on ships, with 5 crew members killed on 2 vessels. Markets reacted immediately, because Hormuz is not symbolic, it is systemic. From Washington's perspective, the response also fits standard doctrine. The U.S. position was that freedom of navigation had to be restored, allies had to be reassured, and coercion against global shipping could not become a new normal. President Trump publicly raised U.S. naval escorts and political risk insurance for maritime trade. CENTCOM later launched Project Freedom to support merchant vessels transiting the strait. In this reading, there was no intricate trap. There was only a familiar pattern. Iran lashes out under pressure, the United States protects commerce, and both sides test how far the other is willing to go. That explanation is coherent. It matches the surface facts. And for many observers, it is enough. The pivot question. But here is what most coverage misses. If retaliation was the whole story, why did Iran focus so much on making Hormuz dangerous and expensive rather than permanently impassable? And if American strategy was simply to restore navigation, why did Washington end up spending so much effort managing insurers, shipping behavior, Gulf anxieties, and diplomatic signaling, rather than simply defeating an Iranian navy at sea? That is where strategy replaces headlines. Evidence 1. Hormuz matters more to the world than it does to America. The first fact is structural. In 2024, roughly 20 million barrels per day moved through the Strait of Hormuz. That was equal to about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption and more than 1/4 of global seaborne oil trade. Around 1/5 of global LNG trade also passed through the strait, much of it from Qatar. Yet the United States imported only about 0.5 million barrels per day of crude and condensate through Hormuz in 2024.
That was just 7% of U.S. crude imports and about 2% of U.S. petroleum liquids consumption. Think about that. America had a huge strategic interest in keeping Hormuz open, but a much smaller direct energy dependence than Asia or many Gulf partners. That asymmetry matters. It means Tehran was targeting a corridor Washington feels compelled to defend, even though the immediate economic pain falls more heavily on others. That is a very different kind of battlefield. That logic surfaced in diplomacy as well as in shipping data. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, discussing the danger of a closure, urged Beijing to pressure Tehran because China heavily depends on the Strait of Hormuz for its oil. The wording matters, because it reveals the strategic map underneath the rhetoric. Tehran was not merely threatening the United States, it was threatening the entire system that Washington underwrites. Evidence 2. The strait did not need to be physically closed to become strategically closed. Now notice something unusual. According to the Congressional Research Service, by March 8, 2026, shipping traffic was essentially at a standstill inside and outside the strait. But there was no giant naval battle, no cinematic fleet engagement, no dramatic blockade line stretching across the entire waterway. Instead, there were 10 attacks on ships, 5 deaths. War risk premiums reportedly rose to 4 or 5 times previous levels. Some policies carried a 72-hour cancellation clause. Brent crude jumped 8%, from $71.32 per barrel on February 27th to $77.24 on March 2nd, and later, it broke $100. In Asia and Europe, daily natural gas prices rose 54% and 63% in a week. U.S. gas prices rose only 7%. That is not a minor detail. That is the whole mechanism. A choke point can be economically shut long before it is physically sealed. If underwriters cancel, tanker captains hesitate, and charterers refuse the risk, the corridor stops functioning at commercial scale. You do not need continuous missile fire. You need uncertainty, persistent uncertainty. Evidence 3. Reopening commerce imposed far higher costs on Washington. On May 3, 2026, CENTCOM announced support for Project Freedom, saying the mission would restore freedom of navigation for commercial shipping through Hormuz. The scale is revealing. Guided missile destroyers, more than 100 land and sea-based aircraft, multi-domain unmanned platforms, and 15,000 service members. Look at the incentives. Iran did not need parity with the U.S. Navy. It needed to force a far stronger power into an expensive, politically visible, globally scrutinized protection mission. Washington had to reassure traders, Gulf monarchies, energy markets, insurers, and domestic audiences all at once. Tehran only had to preserve enough risk that the reassurance effort remained incomplete. That is a classic cost transfer dynamic. The weaker actor spends less, but forces the stronger actor to spend more, financially, militarily, politically. Evidence 4. Washington answered with tools it has historically used against others. This changes everything. The American response was not just escort and deterrence, it was also coercion. By April 13th, 14th, 2026, the United States had implemented a blockade of Iranian ports, and CENTCOM stated that in less than 36 hours, U.S. forces had completely halted economic trade going into and out of Iran by sea. That is a familiar American playbook. Use maritime dominance not merely to protect traffic, but to restrict access, raise costs, and squeeze the adversary's economy. But here is the mirror image problem. Once Washington chose blockade, Tehran's incentive to contest maritime access became even stronger. The conflict stopped being only about missiles or nuclear sites. It became a battle over whose pressure on trade would prove more politically durable. Iran did not have to win sea control. It only had to keep the U.S. from translating naval superiority into normal commerce. In that sense, Tehran maneuvered Washington onto a board America knows well, but one where the stronger side inherits the burden of order. Evidence 5. America's own doctrine describes something close to the tactic Iran exploited. The official U.S. Marine Corps concept for stand-in forces describes them as small but lethal, low-signature, mobile forces operating inside a contested area to intentionally disrupt the plans of a potential or actual adversary. The concept is maritime at its core. Deny freedom of movement, complicate targeting, persist near choke points, force the enemy to operate under constant uncertainty. That does not mean Iran literally copied a Marine Corps manual line by line. Strategic imitation is rarely that neat, but the resemblance is hard to ignore. Small, mobile, relatively cheap systems operating from the littoral. Pressure concentrated on maneuver and access. Victory measured less by tonnage sunk than by options constrained. Iran did not need decisive victory. It needed persistent doubt. Evidence 6. The strongest evidence is who bore the burden of stabilization. By June, the burden of normalization was visibly American. The United States was reassuring Gulf allies that navigation would remain free, unconditional, and unrestricted. U.S. officials reported that roughly 20 million barrels of crude had exited Hormuz in a 24-hour period as flows recovered. Even after reopening, the discussion remained about tolls, insurance, allied reassurance, and whether traffic would return to normal. That is the quiet part said out loud. The side that must prove the system still works is the side carrying the strategic burden. The timeline. Event 1, February 28th to March 4th, 2026. The United States launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, targeting Iranian military and naval infrastructure. Within days, according to CRS, Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. This matters because the sequence suggests Hormuz was used not as an opening move, but as a retaliatory lever after direct military pressure. Tehran shifted the arena from strike-for-strike escalation to commercial risk escalation. Event 2, March 4th to early March. The practical effect arrived quickly. UK MTO counted 10 ship attacks by March 8th, 5 fatalities. Insurance costs surged. Brent rose. Asian and European gas prices spiked much more than US prices. The military exchange had become a market event, and that meant Iran had found a way to multiply pressure beyond the battlefield. Event 3, April to May. Washington escalated in its own register. The United States blockaded Iranian ports in mid-April. By May 3rd, CENTCOM was supporting Project Freedom with destroyers, aircraft, unmanned systems, and 15,000 personnel. This was not just military superiority on display. It was the conversion of superiority into guardianship. The United States had become the manager of system recovery. Event 4, June 2026. Negotiations and partial reopening followed. On June 14th, President Trump announced a deal was complete and authorized the opening of Hormuz and removal of the blockade. CENTCOM confirmed the blockade was lifted on June 18th. By late June, recovering flows and intense U.S. diplomacy with Gulf allies dominated the conversation. Tolls, access, assurances. Chronology reveals the strategic logic. Iran raised the costs of maritime normality. The United States spent months trying to restore it. The real mechanism.
Here is the concept rarely explained in news coverage. Commercial closure is not the same as geographic closure. A strait can remain physically open on a map while becoming functionally closed in the real economy. Why? Because shipping runs on confidence. The captain needs a route. The charterer needs a contract. The insurer needs a price. The underwriter needs a tolerable probability of loss. If even one of those breaks, the ship may not sail. That means a drone sighting, a mine threat, or a single strike can produce effects far larger than the blast radius. It changes actuarial math, and actuarial math changes world trade. This is why sea denial in Hormuz is so dangerous. A superpower can escort ships. It can destroy launchers. It can issue guarantees. But it cannot easily order private fear to disappear. The market must believe the corridor is safe. Until then, the stronger navy is stuck doing something much harder than winning a fight. It has to recreate confidence. That takes longer, and that delay is where leverage lives. So, did Iran use America's own playbook? To trap Washington in Hormuz? Not in the crude sense. Iran did not outfight the U.S. Navy. It did not seize lasting sea control, and it did not make America strategically helpless. Those claims would go too far. But in a narrower and more serious sense, the evidence suggests yes. Iran appears to have used a mirror strategy built on principles the United States understands very well. Deny access rather than seek symmetrical victory. Raise the economic cost of insecurity, and force the stronger power to shoulder the burden of system maintenance. America has long used sanctions, blockade, convoy protection, and maritime access control to transfer pressure onto adversaries. In 2026, Tehran seems to have inverted that logic. It made Washington responsible for proving that the Gulf trading system could still function. That is the trap, not military encirclement, strategic obligation. The Hormuz trap. The pattern becomes clearer when you connect the earlier pieces. Geography made Hormuz globally decisive. Energy flows made Asia particularly exposed. Iran's relatively modest military spending meant Tehran could not hope to match U.S. force-on-force capability. So it leaned on the cheaper side of the equation: disruption, risk, uncertainty. The Marine Corps concept of stand-in forces provides a useful analogy here. Small, low signature, mobile capabilities operating from within the contested zone, complicating maneuver, imposing costs, creating doubt. Tehran did not need decisive victory. It needed persistent doubt. That is why I would call this strategy the Hormuz trap. The trap works like this. Iran creates enough danger that the United States cannot ignore the corridor. Washington then must commit high-value assets, diplomatic capital, insurance guarantees, and political credibility to reopening a maritime artery that matters more economically to others than to itself. If commerce does not normalize, America looks ineffective. If America escalates too far, it risks a broader war. And if it negotiates too early, Iran can claim endurance paid off. That is not total Iranian control, but it is a strategically intelligent way for a weaker state to shape the choices of a stronger one. Return to the Bridgeton. Go back to the Bridgeton in 1987. The tanker kept moving after the mine strike. The convoy was not annihilated. The U.S. Navy remained overwhelmingly stronger than Iran. And yet the political lesson of the episode was that a weaker actor in Hormuz can force a superpower into a protective role it never fully controls. That is what seems to have happened again. The strongest navy can clear lanes. It can escort hulls. It can blockade ports. but it cannot instantly erase the strategic fact that fear is cheaper to manufacture than confidence is to restore. Final payoff. So the deeper answer is not that Iran trapped America in a simple military ambush. It is that Iran appears to have trapped Washington in a system management dilemma. The United States had to guarantee order in a waterway whose disruption sent oil traders, gas buyers, insurers, Gulf monarchies, and Asian importers looking to Washington for stabilization. That is a very American burden. And in 2026, Tehran seems to have understood that burden well enough to weaponize it. The next chapter probably will not begin with missiles. It will begin with underwriters, routing orders, Gulf diplomacy, and the quiet question every great power eventually faces. When you become the guarantor of a system, how much pain can a smaller state impose before protection itself becomes the trap?